Okay, and welcome to part 4, where we analyze the primary source documents to write our essay. We know that the revolution from our brainstorm has to do with representation, unfair laws, taxation, and self-governance. Okay, so this I distilled from my brainstorm section. Let's see if these documents have anything to do with the aforementioned list. I'm going to switch colors here to green just to make it stand out a bit. Thomas Jefferson, Summary of British Rights, 1774. I know that this is towards the end of the Revolution. So can any one reason be assigned by 160,000 electors in the island of Great Britain should give law to 4 millions in the states of America, every individual of whom is equal to every individual of them in virtue, in understanding, and in bodily strength? So he's posing a question, saying how are the 4 million equal to the 160,000? Because those numbers don't track. He doesn't believe it's fair that 160,000 people can make a decision for 4 million people across the Atlantic Ocean, especially if they are to be equal. Back to the quote. Were this to be admitted, instead of being a free people, as we should have hitherto supposed and mean to continue ourselves, we should suddenly be found the slaves, not of one, but of 160,000 tyrants. Notice how he makes the transition from being a free people to an enslaved people. So they felt that a lack of representation pretty much reduced their status to slaves. Back to the quote. But of 160,000 distinguished too from all others by this singular circumstance, that they are removed from the reach of fear, the only restraining motive which may hold the hand of a tyrant. Okay, so from this document, I know that Thomas Jefferson is upset about representation, not feeling equal. This can connect back to the unfair laws. He doesn't really say anything about taxes or the Quartering Act or the Proclamation of 1763, the Summary of British Rights. It's actually a very long document, but this is just one excerpt. But we know that he's upset about representation, so we're going to add that to our essay, and we know that going in. Source 2, Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, 1768. I would say this is in the kind of early to mid-range of the Revolution. So I'm not sure who a Pennsylvania farmer is. This is a code name or a pen name, a cover name, because it was written by John Dickinson, but he didn't want to release his identity at the time. That I know from reading the documents, but if I didn't know, I can just assume that this person is writing from the perspective of a Pennsylvania farmer and holds the views and values of a Pennsylvania farmer. So there is one consideration arising from the suspension, which is not generally attended to, but shews its importance very clearly. It was not necessary that this suspension should be caused by an act of Parliament. Okay, we know that Parliament passed a series of laws in the 1760s into the 1770s that really upset the colonists, so they passed a law suspending something. But what did they suspend? The Crown might have restrained the governor of New York even from calling the assembly together by its prerogative in the royal governments. Okay, I'll stop right there. The term prerogative always refers to the King George ability to govern. So the crown and prerogative go hand in hand. So when King George does something, it's within his rights or it's his prerogative to make that decision or do whatever he pleased to do. So Parliament has its role in governing the empire, but the king has his prerogatives or his role. And one such role was to appoint the governors in the colonies. That's why they say royal governments. This step, I suppose, would have been taken if the conduct of the Assembly of New York had been regarded as an act of disobedience to the Crown alone, but it is regarded as an act of disobedience to the authority of the British legislature. So, John Dickinson, or the Pennsylvania farmer, is upset that Parliament suspended the New York Assembly, which is how the colonists got to have their legislation. So let me write this out. Parliament suspended the New York Assembly, which infringed on their right to self-govern. Okay, and that ties back to the concept of self-governing and representation, unfair laws. Now, John Dickinson presumably thought it would be okay if the Crown pulled this back or if King George made this decision, but he thinks it's unfair because Parliament overreached its boundaries. Okay, source 3, Declaration of Rebellion by King George III, 1775. So this we know is near the end of the Revolution, and we barely hear from King George III directly. So what did he have in his name? Quote, "But that all our subjects of this realm, and the dominions thereunto belonging, are bound by law to be aiding and assisting in the suppression of such rebellion, and to disclose and make known all traitorous conspiracies and attempts against us, our crown and dignity. And we do accordingly strictly charge and command all our officers, as well as civil as military, and all others our obedient and loyal subjects, to use their utmost endeavors to withstand and suppress such rebellion, and to disclose and make known all treasons and traitorous conspiracies which they shall know to be against us, our crown and dignity." So I can tell here that just by the date alone, 1775, I know this is very close to 1776, and that the revolution is a matter of if it will happen. I'm sorry, it's a matter of how it will happen, not if it will happen. So, Declaration of Rebellion by King George III. So at this point, King George is ready for war, or is ready, I'll at least say ready, to get violent and use the military against the colonists. So why did the American Revolution happen? Well, it takes two to fight a war. So it takes two sides to fight a war. And at this point, we know the revolution is just a matter of how it's going to unfold, not a matter of if, right? The reform efforts have failed, negotiations have failed. This is it, folks. So we know that he's going to suppress such rebellion, which means he wants to stop the colonies from seceding. Now, this wasn't really tied into what we discussed in the list of representation and self-governing unfair laws. This is really more so of an immediate cause of the war, is that it just became so violent, and it was unexpected at the time that it would turn out like this. But that's one cause of the war, is that negotiations failed and violence seemed like an appropriate response. King George felt that it was justified to put down the rebellion. He felt he had that right. Source 4, Declaratory Act of 1766. This is early on. This is early on in the Revolution. So, may it therefore please, and I imagine there was actually some dots before this, because these are quotes and clips. So, may it therefore please your most excellent majesty that it may be declared, and be it declared by the king's most excellent majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in the present Parliament assembled. So I know Parliament is together declaring this, and by the authority of the same, that the said colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be subordinate unto, and dependent upon the imperial crown and Parliament of Great Britain. Okay, I would say this last line is probably the most important. So the Declaratory Act is making clear definitively that Parliament has the right to rule over the colonies. There were debates about the taxes and if they were internal or external, fair or unfair, but at this point, Parliament is making it clear and decisive that not only can they regulate taxes, they can regulate anything. That the colonies are under full control. Now, this ties back to the idea of self-governing, that there was no representation. So they didn't have any. There was a loss of representation, or a lack thereof, which made all laws unfair inherently. And the Declaratory Act is here to say they have the right to rule whether you like it or not. And that's going to be a major cause in the revolution. Source 5, Royal Proclamation of 1763. This we know from the brainstorm that it blocked westward expansion. Let's see if we can find any text evidence to back that up. And we can write about that easily. As also that no governor or commander-in-chief in any of our other colonies or plantations in America do presume for the present and until our further pleasure be known to grant warrants of survey or pass patents for any lands beyond the heads of the sources of any of the rivers which fall into the Atlantic Ocean from the west and northwest, or upon any lands whatever which, not having been ceded to or purchased by us as aforesaid, are reserved to said Indians, or any of them. It's important to know that from the British perspective, they wanted to protect Native Americans because they made alliances with some of them. So we know that this blocked westward expansion, but it was done so in the name of protecting Native Americans and their land because of the alliances. Now the colonists are very upset by this because they thought that it was unfair to them. They believe they had the right to move out westward. Okay, last but not least, Source 6, Sugar Act of 1764. This is early on in the American Revolutionary saga. Whereas it is expedient that new provisions and regulations should be established for improving the revenue of this kingdom and for extending and securing the navigation and commerce between Great Britain and your Majesty's dominions in America, which by the peace have been so happily enlarged. And whereas it is just and necessary that a revenue be raised in your Majesty's said dominions in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. Okay, it's important to know that it's not that the founders were against all taxes, but they took special interest in this one because they thought it was the first time that they were raising revenue for the kingdom and that only they had to pay, because it says expedient that new provisions and regulations should be established for improving the revenue of this kingdom and for extending and securing the navigation commerce between Great Britain in America, which by the peace have been so happily enlarged, and whereas it is just and necessary that revenue be raised for securing the same. So it's talking about revenue being raised by the Americans to protect America. Now they thought it was unfair that the British in England didn't have to pay this, and that they weren't even allowed to move out west, but they still had to pay taxes to pay off a debt. And this all just struck them as odd and inconsistent with how the first half of the 1700s went. So they thought this was an unfair tax. But remember, they're not against all taxes. Okay, those are our documents, and let's see how we can write our essay in part 5.